Hello, welcome to History of England, episode 39, The Rise of Mary. Now, last time, I looked at the legacy of Edward VI and how the reform of the Church of England really can be credited to him. I looked at early 1550s England, how everything Northumberland touched turned to ash. And then, as examining the last days of Edward VI, I turned to the attempted coup d'etat of Northumberland, who tried to put his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, in as queen, and finally, the victory of Mary Tudor as Queen Mary I. Now, Mary I saw her ascension to the crown as part of a sacred dispensation. It was her destiny, her duty to bring England back to the Catholicism of her fathers. On a secular level, it could also be stated that a popular rebellion had overthrown an established regime. She had gained the throne largely as a result of the loyalty of her Catholic nobility. No publicly proclaimed Protestant lord supported her. As soon as she heard that she had been proclaimed queen in London, she ordered the crucifix be set up once more in her chapel at Framingham. Now, when she first rode into London, many households placed images of the Virgin and the saints in the windows, showing that times had changed. News of her ascension reached a congregation gathered in Exeter Cathedral to hear the reformer Miles Coverdale. The porters whispered around the room, and slowly people got up and walked out. Only a few of the so-called godly stayed. All over England, all over Wales, the Mass was chanted again in Latin. Without statutes, without proclamations, the images and altars of the old faith were quickly restored. Crucifixes were back up, statues back in the old familiar places. A justice who tried to arrest some priests in Kent for saying Mass was thrown in prison. 7 Masses were now being sung every day in the Royal Chapel of Whitehall, as it had once again become the centerpiece of true faith. Mary's first issue was to deal with how she wanted to handle her stepbrother's funeral. She did not want to use a reformed burial service. She eventually agreed to avoid public controversy by letting him be buried reluctantly according to the rite he had favored while alive. She also tried to safeguard his soul and her principles by having a Latin Mass for the dead sung the night before with a solemn requiem days later. On August 18th, 1553, Mary issued a proclamation concerning religion in which she forbade using terms like Baptist. She commanded that no one would be allowed in a sermon or lessons held in the church to interpret the scriptures or teach anything pertaining to religion except in improved schools or universities. In other words, she had banned all radical and reformed preachers. She asserted that she had no thought of religious compulsion, but this could change in the future. But in certain places, resistance to the reintroduction of Orthodox Catholicism could be fierce. Some preachers continued to proclaim the true doctrine of King Edward VI. London was still the center of religious radicalism. One Catholic chaplain preaching at Paul's Cross had to be hurried away as a large crowd had gathered and started to throw daggers at the pulpit. But nevertheless, the European reformers began to quickly make their way back to Zurich, Geneva, and Strasbourg. The colony of Walloon weavers who had settled in Glastonbury stated they were happy to go back home. Now, there are other instances of rebellion that took place. In Suffolk, a church was set on fire as Mass was being said. A radical named Thomas Flower pulled a knife from his belt while communion was being performed and tried to stab the priest. The reformers soon began to meet in private, usually in fields or in ships moored in the Thames in the middle of the night. Edward Bonner, released from Marshalsea prison, restored as Bishop of London, made it clear that his life goal was continued persecution of the reformers, and he would earn his nickname of Bloody Bonner in the next few years. Also restored as Bishop of Winchester and now made Lord Chancellor for Mary's Privy Council was Stephen Gardiner. Gardiner also made it priority to remove to prison as many Protestant reformers as he could lay his hands on, often refusing to allow them a defense beforehand. Now, we cannot from 2019 gauged the true faith in England in 1553. It is clear that only a minority of the people were committed to the Church of England, and that a slightly larger number now became public Catholics once again. The change in direction of religious policy from the left to the right, from attacks upon the rituals of old faith, from stripping of churches, all had consequences for the piety of the people. The sacred bonds have been loosed, and they cannot be retied. It is possible, therefore, that there was really no drift from right to left and back to the right, just a movement from the fervent of the medieval period to bland conformism and indifference. This theory works when you remember that for England, the Reformation was less about asserting faith and principle and more about redistributing wealth and power. Habit and custom, and not faith and piety, was what determined English religion. Now, Mary was the first woman in English history, if you did not include Lady Jane Grey, to be proclaimed Queen Regent. Her one possible predecessor, Matilda, had never been crowned and was known simply as Lady Matilda. But Mary did have a president. Her grandmother, Isabella, had ruled as Queen of Castile and had her own royal court. And it seems likely that as a child, Mary was told everything she could learn about her grandmother from her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary's great-grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, had been the power behind the throne of her son, Henry VII. And her cousin, Margaret, had been ruling as Queen Regent of Flanders for about 20 years. As a child, she was brought up to be queen. No one was ever allowed to kiss her except on her hand, and in formal rituals, everyone knelt to her. Here was a tradition of female leadership she could draw upon. Besides Stephen Gardiner as Lord Chancellor, Mary used members of her household as her first advisors. But she could not wholly dispense with the members of the Regency Council of Edward VI. Only they had the knowledge and skill to maintain the system of government. So, 2 days before her coronation, she summoned them, sinking to her knees in front of them, spoke of the duty that God had placed on her as queen. She asked them to do their duty to her as she did it to God. And according to the Spanish ambassador who was in the room, no one knew how to reply. But this was a political move. She knew that many of them had been hostile to her while Edward lived, and had signed the decree banning her from the succession. And she did not trust them. In the end, she had a large, unwieldy Privy Council made of about 50 members. She hated the divisions among them. She knew some had always been loyal to her, others had been disloyal until they knew she was going to win, and they suddenly changed sides. Some were conservative bishops just released from prison, others great lords who'd done well out of seizing the monastic lands. She spent most of her time shouting at them. But she did form a small inner council of about 7 men, led by Stephen Gardiner and other professional administrators who had served Edward VI. And she usually dealt with these people. Now Mary set about the business of governing with a will. She rose at dawn. She prayed, she had a private mass, and then went to her desk and stayed until 2 in the afternoon. She'd have a light lunch and go back to her desk until midnight. She wrote letters, she granted audiences, and she met with her council. But it was still believed she needed to find a husband, for a female queen ruling the country was considered unnatural, and she needed a male figure of authority by her side. On August 14th, 1553, she summoned her first parliament, and it met on October 5th. The first question they needed to debate was the question of who she should marry. Most of the House of Lords, most of the House of Commons said she should marry an Englishman. On October 9th, at her formal coronation, she wore her hair loose as a symbol that she was a virgin. Now, Parliament also debated other matters. They passed a bill affirming the fidelity of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which legitimized Mary's claim to the throne. She was no longer a bastard. They passed an act to enforce the religious settlement as it stood in 1547, getting rid of everything Edward had done. Now, this matter caused long debate. 4 days. It was eventually agreed by 270 to 80. This shows, however, that a large minority still supported the Edwardian reforms. The members of Parliament also let it be known that there is 2 topics on which they agreed. No restoration of church property, no restoration of papal authority. Now in November, John Pollard, who had been elected Speaker of the House of Commons, met with Mary and her Privy Council. He presented her with a petition on the question of marriage, and in a long speech urged the Queen to choose one of her subjects to marry. He said it would not be fitting to choose a European prince, since that prince would have other interests that would not be priorities of England. In this speech, Mary stood up to her feet and told Pollard that if the House of Commons forced her to marry a man she did not like, she'd be dead 3 months later. But there are others discussing the matter of marriage of her. The Spanish ambassador had met with her 9 days after she became queen and asked her who she planned to marry. She said she'd be willing to follow the advice of her cousin Charles I, which meant she'd be willing to marry a member of the Spanish royal family, of which she was already a part, you have to remember. She was, remember, half Spanish. The most suitable of the candidates was Charles' son, Felipe, who was the eldest son Charles, and this is what the House of Lords and House of Commons feared. Now Mary summoned the Spanish ambassador to a private chapel in the fall of 1553 as Parliament was meeting. This is where she kept the Holy Sacrament, and this is where she told the ambassador that she continued to pray and weep on who God would want her to marry. Now she told him she resolved to marry Felipe. He was, in a sense, a natural choice, for how could the Queen of England marry one of her subjects? But there was one possible English candidate. Edward Courtenay, great-grandson of Edward IV, heir to the House of York, a prisoner for 15 years on trumped-up charges of treason. The fact that he bore Plantagenet blood was seen as a threat to the Tudor dynasty. Now Mary had released him, but she did not wish to marry him. She told her Privy Council this. He was feeble and lazy because of his prison term, so she turned to Spain and she did not look back. Now shortly afterwards, she received the Spanish ambassador at court. As he bowed to her, he whispered in her ear that he had credentials from the emperor to hand to her. He then passed her a letter, which he quickly concealed. The next evening, he was brought by royal barge to the palace bearing the official proposal to Mary I marry Felipe. Days later, as Mary was being escorted to the royal chapel for vespers, someone in the court yelled out, "Treason!" Mary continued on undisturbed, but a younger stepsister in the crowd started to tremble. See, Princess Elizabeth had mostly been a spectator in these marriage proceedings. She had followed Mary in a triumphal entry into London as a way of advertising their accord and rebutting the claims of a rival family. But Mary and Elizabeth did not get along. Elizabeth was seen quietly to represent the Protestant influence at court, and she was under suspicion for this by the court. She refused to hear Mass. She refused to go with Mary to the royal chapel because she was as proud and fiery as all the other Tudors. You have to remember that. Tudors equal proud and fiery. Okay. Now Elizabeth knew that she needed to bend. So on hearing that her refusal to hear Mass was considered rebellion, she fell upon her knees before Mary and begged to be given instruction in the Roman Catholic faith. But sincerity can be doubted. She was known to be friendly to so-called heretics. That fall, attending the first Mass, she complained all the way to the chapel that she had stomachache, and she refused to wear the rosary that Mary had given her as a gift. Now Mary let her court know that despite what her father's will called for, she did not wish to have Elizabeth succeed her. The only remedy of this was to have a child, however. The Queen was now 37, spare, lean, thin-mouthed, commanding gaze. Elizabeth was 20, youth and beauty at her side. She might be a threat. Now this threat seemed to emerge in a rebellion in January 1554. Early that month, envoys from Spain arrived to seal the terms of the marriage treaty with Felipe. But wherever they went in London, they received a cold reception, and schoolboys were seen throwing snowballs at them. On January 14th, the terms were publicly announced. The terms restricted Felipe's role in determining policy, but many refused to believe he would sit quietly on the sidelines. Now, by this time, religion and politics went hand in hand in England, In late 1553, as Parliament was dissolved, Mary decreed that the Mass and the Latin offices were the only official means to worship in England. That December, a dead dog was thrown through the windows of a royal chamber. It had been shaved with a tonsure like a monk. And later on, a dead cat was found hanging in Friday Street wearing Catholic vestments and holding between its paws a piece of bread representing the body of Christ. Ah, you English people. Anyway, the leaders of the Protestant cause were now beginning to act in concert. Among them is Sir Thomas Wyatt, the son of the poet, and also involved is the Duke of Suffolk, along with his three brothers. Now, Suffolk was, of course, the father of Lady Jane Grey. Edward Courtenay, angered at being denied marriage to Mary, joined them. Now, they were to the French ambassador, because France is angry that Mary had chosen to marry the son of the long-term enemy. You had to remember, France and Spain have been fighting for like about 50 years now. Now, other rebels were simply opposed to the Spanish having any say in English policy, and there are others who were reformers who were dismayed that Roman Catholicism was coming back to England again. Some of these rebels had in fact served under Northumberland during the reign of Edward VI. It was decided that Cornwall and Devonshire were to rise in rebellion first, and the riot would go to Kent, bring them into rebellion, and Suffolk would go to the Midlands and bring them into rebellion. All the armies would meet together, they'd march to London, and hope to have citizens of the city throw open the gates. Now, in early January, the conspirators met in London to show their faces at court, but during that time, Edward Courtenay began to get cold feet. Even though the Spanish were hanging around, he came to believe that Mary was going to marry him after all evidence to the contrary. He hung about court to see his future wife, and he wore an outlandish costume showing his new state. He also spoke to people about the plot. Doy. Anyway, Stephen Gardiner, Lord Chancellor, interviewed him and learned more about the plot and summoned Sir Peter Carew, one of the other plotters, to London. Now, Carew panicked and fled to Exeter, tried to get to rise, and then he fled to France. Now, Riot, confused about all the unanticipated, unwelcome news, went to Kent, called them in rebellion. On January 25th, the church bells of the county rang with a signal for alarm, and Wyatt issued a proclamation that the Spanish were coming to conquer England. He seized the cannons from ships moored in the Medway and brought them to Rochester. Now, meanwhile, Mary I had been told about the rebellion, and she said she's not afraid, but she should have been. There's no standing army. Many in the previous council were eager to see her dethroned, remember. London told her, okay, we'll let you use 500 militiamen, but only because they did not want to see London captured, not because they loved Mary. Now, Honore II had promised to send 80 ships to aid the rebels, and this news somehow reached the English royal court. The French ambassador was watched by royal spies, and one of his couriers was arrested. The courier was carrying coded messages from the ambassador and a copy of a letter from Princess Elizabeth to Queen Mary I. No treason, but this was suspicious. Why would the French king be interested in a letter of Elizabeth's? Anyway, Mary sent Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, to lead the militia from London to Rochester. But as he approached Rochester, he saw to his horror that his men were deserting to Riot. They cried out that they're all Englishmen, and so Norfolk and his commanders fled for their lives. Riot approached the bridge, told those who gathered around him that if they wish to join him, they're welcome. They wish to leave, they can go. 400 men joined his cause, along with their weapons. The rebellion seemed to be on the cusp of success, and if he had marched to London right then, he could have taken the city. But he didn't. Mary knew she was defenseless, but she remained resolute and defiant. She rode through the city streets of Guildhall to meet the assembly of London citizens. Now, Mary had a very deep voice, and she had piercing eyes that commanded respect and fear. She stood on the steps of the Guildhall, and she spoke to them of the love and loyalty of London against a presumptuous rebel who had let loose his troops on the city to rain havoc. She promised that she would call on the new parliament to consider the suitability of Felipe as her consort, and if the House of Lords and the House of Commons vetoed the marriage, she'd break off the engagement. Now this impressed the Londoners, and the next day they sent 25,000 armed citizens to defend her and the city against Wyatt and his army. Now Wyatt, meanwhile, had arrived at Greenwich, but he was too late. He found the city gates closed against him. He was declared a traitor and had a £100 reward placed on his head. Now, meanwhile, Wyatt had heard that the Duke of Suffolk had failed in his bid to raise the Midlands to the cause of rebellion. Suffolk was hiding on one of his estates. But Suffolk's gatekeeper had betrayed him, and he was arrested. Now, his ally in the Midland Rebellion was Lord John Grey, uncle of Lady Jane, who had hidden in the hollow trunk of an old tree without food or water for 2 days. And then he was found and arrested. Now, Wyatt heard all this, and he marched to London Bridge. He stood still before the barred gates, the guns of the tower trained on him and his men. Now, he could not cross the river here, and so he decided he'd ride with his army to Kensington Bridge and march on London from that direction. Now, he'd been told his friends in the city would open the gates to him. So the following morning, with 1,500 men and cannon from the Midway, he rode away, and at 4 in the afternoon arrived at Kingston. He found the bridge torn up and a small guard on the opposite bank. The guard fled. The riot had the bridge repaired with moored barges, and then once again marched on London. Now Mary was woken at 3 in the morning, told her royal barge was waiting to take her to Windsor Castle and safety, and she asked her best friends what she should do. The Spanish ambassador told her if she fled, London would rise, the tower would be captured, the prisoners released, and she would see Elizabeth proclaimed queen in her place. If all the plans to restore Catholicism would come to naught, so she decided she was going to stay. At 9 that morning, Wyatt arrived with his now exhausted army at Knightsbridge, and there a group of royal cavalry divided them and chased them to Hyde Park Corner. Now Wyatt continued to march forward with what was left of his army, and some citizens gathered to watch, but they made no sign they would support him. They simply stood and then let the rebels through. Mary was told that this occurred, and she said if some would not fight for her, she would go out and fight herself and die with those who would serve her. But she stayed put at Whitehall Palace, because it's not needed for Mary personally to go out and fight, because Wyatt and the rest of his forces found the gates of Ludgate closed against them. So Wyatt just simply sank on a bench outside Bell Savage Yard, and his army scattered into the nearby streets and alleys. A group of royal cavalry arrested him, and he took him to the Tower. The days that followed, gallows were raised at Smithfield and on Tower Hill. Some of the rebel soldiers who had been caught were simply hanged outside their own homes. The most who had been rebels were hanged, but there was some mercy shown among all the slaughter. On February 22nd, Mary pardoned 400 men who had come to her to beg mercy. Now, Lady Jane Grey was still in the Tower of London. She had been there since Mary took the throne in August. She may have been expected to be left alone there, and she probably could have lived out her life there. But there's one problem. She was now implicated in the failed rebellion because of what her father had done. The Queen decided the whole Grey family had to go. The old abbot of Westminster was sent to see Jane and try to convert her to Roman Catholicism, but she refused to budge. She was taken to Tower Green. She was allowed to pray next to the scaffold. She climbed the steps on her own. She told those who gathered around that she had committed treason by trying to seize the crown, but she never had evil intentions. She then recited Psalm 51 and tied her hair up so her neck would be uncovered. She kneeled by the block. She tied a handkerchief about her eyes, and at that point she lost her composure. She could not find the block. When the bystanders led her to the block, she laid her head on it, beheaded quickly, along with her husband, her father, and her 3 uncles. But there's one more that invited suspicion, but she had not yet been punished. Princess Elizabeth had stayed out of harm's way at Ashridge House in Hertfordshire, and she watched events unfold there. Now, it was clear that Wyatt had intended to overthrow Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne, but there was no evidence that she was ever involved in the plot. Her personal servants were interrogated in the Tower and threatened with the rack. Elizabeth was summoned to London, and she pleaded illness, but she was taken to London anyway in a personal litter on February 18th. She passed the city streets dressed in white to show she was innocent. The Spanish ambassador met with Mary and told her that Charles I wished to see Elizabeth executed. Now, Mary refused to see Elizabeth. She was taken to a suite of rooms in the palace at Whitehall and guarded, not allowed to leave the suite. She stayed here for weeks, and finally, in early April, she was interviewed by the Privy Council and was accused of complicity in the rebellion. She said she was not involved, and she was told she'd be taken to the Tower of London. She feared that she would be executed there. That's where her mother Anne Boleyn had been executed. So she wrote a letter to Mary protesting her innocence, but Mary refused to read the letter. Now Elizabeth was taken into the Tower. All the doors locked and barred behind her. Later on, she would tell the French ambassador that she told the guards to pass the news to Mary that if her execution was what was going to happen, she'd rather be by sword than axe like her mother. Now, her confinement was not that bad in the Tower. She was allowed to walk at will in the Tower itself, 4 guards always by her side. Now, 5 days after entering the Tower, she was again interrogated. Again, she was asked about connection with Wyatt and the other rebels, and if she'd ever received messages or letters from them. Again, she denied everything, and again she stated she was innocent, demanding to see proof that she was a traitor. And she was told, well, there really isn't any. On May 18th, she was released from the Tower. She was taken to Woodstock in Oxfordshire. There, she was placed as a personal house guest of Sir Henry Bedingfield. Now, she was under house arrest. Troops were camped nearby on a hill overlooking the house. She was not allowed to see anyone without Bedingfield's permission. On July 20th, Prince Felipe landed at Southampton. Now, he was used to the sunshine in Spain. He was met by English rain. Many in his entourage caught cold. 3 days later, he was met at the door of Winchester Cathedral by the bishop, who offered him supper. And that night, he met Mary for the first time. Now, she could understand Spanish. She could not speak it. And this is the first and last time Felipe would ever use English in his life. They were forced to speak French with each other. The Spanish were not impressed by Mary. She was older than they'd been told. She was smaller than they'd been told. She was skinnier than they'd been told. She looked like she was starving. And at 27 years old, Felipe was 11 years younger than his wife-to-be. But they married on July 25th in Winchester Cathedral and were proclaimed King and Queen of England, France, Naples, Jerusalem, and Ireland. Now, Felipe had been made King of Naples the night before, so he could show that he was marrying an equal in Mary. During the mass celebration, many noticed that Mary didn't look at her husband, she looked at the jeweled crucifix. At the wedding feast, the Spanish discovered that Mary was served in gold plates, but Felipe was only allowed silver. In the various royal palaces, Mary was granted use of the royal suite, but Felipe was only given the rooms that a queen consort would have. He was never crowned. He was never allowed to be a source of patronage in England. He was not allowed to fill English officers with his own men. He was not allowed any authority by Mary whatsoever. On August 20th, Mary and Felipe went to hear a sermon given by Stephen Gardiner at Paul's Cross. And here Gardiner told the citizens of London, behave, so that Felipe would stay in England longer. Soon afterwards, 20 cartloads of Spanish gold were drawn through the streets of London. But all the treasure in the world could not allay the fears and suspicion of the London citizens. Rumors spread that the Spanish were sending an army to invade England, and that soon the Spanish friars would take over the churches. It was feared that England would just become part of the Spanish Empire, which you have to remember was huge. I mean, they controlled part of Italy, they controlled Naples, they controlled the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany, they controlled most of the New World, they controlled Spain and Portugal and the Low Countries. Anyway. Then the English started to attack the Spanish courtiers when they saw them in the streets. The Spanish treated the English with disdain. They stated that the women were beautiful, the men were ugly. They said that the English were uncouth. The English was an uncouth language spoken by barbarians. They were shocked that English men, women, and children swore so much. They stated that they drank way too much beer and whiskey, and they belched way too much, by eating dinner at odd hours and supper way too early. The Spanish made fun of the houses of the English, made of dirt and sticks, but they're astonished that most people in England ate as good as Mary I. They ate beef and mutton and veal, lamb and pork and brawn and bacon and fruit pies and every kind of fowl that you can not name. Now, most poor people would not be eating that, by the way. They cannot afford that much food. They probably have eaten butter and cheese and beans and peas and onions and garlic, but the Spanish would not have been observing the poor anyway. The Spanish said the English were way too violent. They could not take a joke. The English were fit for nothing except eating and drinking. They cannot even dance. But they loved to steal everything they could lay their hands on. They loved to fight, and fights often broke out in the streets and even in Whitehall Palace. In one brawl, they observed 500 Englishmen fighting each other. 6 were killed, 36 were wounded. But that fall, it seemed that the fruit of the royal marriage would soon be ripe. Mary believed she was pregnant, and this belief was supported by her doctors. If this was indeed true, then the problems around her husband would be resolved. The Te Deum was sung in all the churches in her realm. Prayers were offered for the safe birth of the heir to the throne. Some, of course, were horrified at the birth of a Catholic child who would keep England Catholic for at least another generation, but most were willing to sit, wait, watch. So next time on History of England, we are going to examine the rest of Mary's reign. Probably. We will look at her religious policy, we'll look at the birth of an heir, the possible birth of an heir, and what happens to England after Mary walked with the ghosts of her father and her stepbrother. My friends, stay tuned.